I was at a business lunch with a business acquaintance of mine, and he said to me, "I really enjoy these lunches. You're my outlier." And I looked at him and he said, I just don't have this kind of conversation with anybody else I know. So today I'm going to talk about conversation and why conversation matters. Before I do that, though, obviously I have to apologize to you all, because what I'm doing is I'm standing here talking about conversation, talking at you, and the irony, of course, is I should be talking with you. So perhaps we can do that a little later. So why does conversation matter? Well, I'll give you just a few thoughts that I have, and maybe you have some others, but one thought is that I sort of worry that we are in an age of introspective quackery. We have this burgeoning, navel-gazing consumer culture that is consuming us. I also worry about critical thinking. Are we trading critical thinking in favor of some folksy, banal mediocrity? Are we socializing certainty? Are we just glibly accepting ignorance, even reveling in ignorance? And then we're in an undeniable age of volume, massive amounts of data being consumed at rapacious speeds, disseminated with astonishing rapidity. And yet we seem to have a vast amount of opinion, but not a lot of contemplation or consideration. It was Emerson who said, "Our America has a bad name for superficialness." And indeed, it seems that the point is to be heard, but not to be heard with a point. And so perhaps we should be looking back to prior examples. Of course, Socrates exhorted us all to know ourselves, but his prescription was much more towards self-enlightenment and not towards narcissism. And so perhaps what we should be doing is thinking about conversation a little more deeply. So before we consider how we can use conversation and how we can have it add adventure into our lives, let's just take a quick, rapid tour of the last 400 years and drop into a few examples of conversational spaces, and here just in the Western tradition. So the London coffee houses of the 17th and 18th centuries weren't just social institutions. In fact, these were centers of civic discourse around science and around politics, around religion, aesthetics, and business. Lloyd's of London started its life, the great Lloyd's of London, in a London coffee house. In fact, Charles II called coffee houses seminaries of sedition and tried to have them closed, but such was their popularity, he had to withdraw from that position. And then, of course, the French salons, famously emblematic of those cultural and intellectual progressive movements and attitudes of Europe's great age of enlightenment. And then these gentlemen, representations of just three of several greats of innovation and business from Britain's Industrial Revolution. These men were members of the Lunar Society, and they included such luminaries as Wedgwood, Watt, Priestley, Murdoch, Bolton, Erasmus Darwin. And what is so important about them, perhaps, is captured really well by Jenny Uglow's book, The Lunar Men, the subtitle to that book, which is 5 Men Whose Curiosity Changed the World. And then this rather astonishing, somewhat pre-Star Wars figure is Hugo Ball. And he was one of the co-founders of the Dada art movement. And here he is performing at the Café Voltaire in Zurich. Again, another example of one of those stunning forums and venues of conversation. And this lovely lady is Alelia Walker, and she hosted a salon in Harlem called the Dark Tower. And appearing at that salon, hosted and featuring at that salon, were such greats in the Harlem Renaissance as Langston Hughes, for example. And so, before moving on, I maybe should give you some sense of what I think conversation is, how I would define it. And I would say for my purpose, what it is not is some facilitated attempt towards a compromise or a consensus. It is not a negotiation. It's not a debate where you have sides rigidly sticking to a view of right and wrong. Nor is it rhetoric, some persuasive attempt to influence how you think about something. No, for my purpose, and I'm going to paraphrase Professor Theodore Zeldin, it's two things. The first is two or more people coming together and sharing memories, habits, experiences, opinions, their thoughts. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, coming into that conversation willing and open to leave that conversation maybe different, slightly changed, maybe even transformed. So these are big thoughts. These are big dreamers, big ideas, a long history. So how do you bring that into your own life? How do you translate that into something we can all do? And so I just want to talk a little bit about what I did. And so that is Squish. And Squish is a personal salon that my wife and I decided we want to move through and explore in a conversational format in our own home. And it's called Squish because we looked at our kitchen table and decided we could fit 13 people around it at a squish. We structured the event. The evenings were held over consecutive Tuesday evenings, typically scheduled for 2 hours, usually running through midnight. And we used one of those great online tools just to invite a pool of 100 people, of whom the first 11 to accept, plus my wife and I, could come to the event. Now, we set no rules whatsoever. The point of this is to allow the conversation to take its own form. The conversation is almost in a way the 14th person there. It's the center of attention. That doesn't mean that the conversation didn't move in an organic way, and indeed it did. The point was we were not controlling its direction. In fact, we wanted it to drift, to flow, to go where it wanted to. That often means that I didn't quite know what had happened during a conversation. And fortunately, I did receive one particular note from a participant who reminded me of that drift. And indeed, the conversation closest to my heart was the apparent truthiness of English dental stereotypes, something I know a lot about. One other point about Squish, no topic. We're not trying to solve a community problem. We weren't trying to tackle some issue or move people towards an end point. That was never the purpose. The purpose is to talk and see what happens. So this exploration now has gone somewhat public, out of our home, and now we are collaborating with local groups such as Omaha Creative Institute, looking to collaborate with Kent Bellows Foundation, Downtown Lit Fest, and the Joslin Art Museum. But it's also inspired us to explore different formats and different structures. And one of those we're calling Art House. The main difference between Art House and Squish is that Art House has a presenter, and it's a surprise presenter. So anybody that decides to sign up and come along has no idea who the presenter is. I don't know what the presenter is going to talk about. The topic is entirely up to them. And the idea is that the presenter gets that conversation going. They choose the topic, but then who knows where it goes from there. And so far, we've been lucky enough this year to have people like Wanda Ewing, Timothy Shaffert, we've had Dusty Davidson and Jeff Katerba, and we have one more event this year. And the presenter for that event is still a surprise. So what then makes up a good conversation? I can't tell you what it should be, but I can tell you a few things that we've learned. Some ingredients to a good conversation. There are probably 4.5. The first one would be people, of course. And I guess I'm just saying to you, just be aware of people. Just be aware of people that you normally engage with. I'm not saying the next time you sit down to someone on a bus, have a profound conversation with them. But I am saying just be aware. There are people you know. Maybe you don't talk to them enough. Just be open. And maybe that's the second ingredient, is to be open. It's inherent within my definition of conversation. Be willing to engage with someone. Third ingredient. Serendipity. Don't plan for things. Open yourself to luck, to fate, to karma. Just welcome it and just see where things go. And that then would be the fourth element to this, is don't set an agenda. Don't set a topic. Don't think about the cause that has to be solved. In fact, that openness is what Princeton professor Kwame Anthony Appiah refers to when he's talking about how you can sidle up to difficult issues incrementally, just allowing conversations to build on each other slowly and slowly until you really get into deep, challenging conversations. And maybe the fourth and a half point is that great social solvent, the libation. It's not essential, but I will say we've had a pretty good time with that. So we also have one or two challenges. And I would quickly say that Doris Lessing said, there is no such thing as dialogue, only intersecting monologues. That's a challenge. Squish is about big talk, not small talk. And so sometimes you do have to control side conversations. Maybe a second challenge has been popularity and the mix of people. We found that the online invitation going out maybe took about as long as 96 minutes to fill all the seats to as little as 12 minutes. So we're crowding people out. So I'm thinking of different formats. But then why bother? If there's no tangible takeaway, this is not something you can measure. You don't get a little prize as you walk out the door saying, hey, good conversation. So it's really up to you. I don't own the outcome. You uniquely take away what it means to you. What I would say is that most people leave feeling somewhat different, somewhat enlivened, somewhat energized. They felt their minds maybe have been moved in a different direction. And so when I think about where potential comes from, I'm reminded of Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From. And he says there aren't eureka moments. There are some, but they don't happen that often. What we should be looking for instead is what he calls the collision of hunches. And he references Stuart Kaufman's work around the adjacent possible. And he's saying that new ideas, new thoughts, new development, it's not a million miles away. You just need to step into the adjacent to find that new idea. And I think conversation can do that. It's the key that opens that door to what's just next to you. So the theme to TEDxOmaha is what is possible. And I would say you can't answer that or even talk about that without acknowledging that conversation matters. And so what I would leave you with is just to ask you, how do you plan to let conversation into your life to explore what is possible? Thank you.